Well, good evening. My name's Randy Silva. Welcome to my channel. We've been talking about different biblical concepts. Just finished the first series that I've done called The Era of the Spirit. And that was an 8-part series. If you haven't listened to it, I hope that you will. I think it was very good. The important takeaway is that the Holy Spirit, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, is very important, crucial, and a very important part of the gospel, a very important part of what it means to be a Christian, and very much to be emphasized. So the next series that I'm starting today is called The Pharisaical Lens. Hopefully that's intriguing to you. And so let's go ahead and get started. So you might be asking yourself, what is a lens? Well, we know what a lens is in terms of like a pair of glasses has lenses, a microscope has lenses, a magnifying glass, a telescope. Those all have lenses, and those lenses help focus the light that's coming in and bring it to a point so that one can observe closely whatever they're looking at. A lens, from a literature standpoint, is you can kind of consider it a series of rules, but it's a list of information, important information about a text that having foreknowledge of that information and then reading the text with that foreknowledge will help one interpret the text from the perspective of the lens. So you can have multiple lenses in order to read various texts. And most of the time, we don't have time when we pick up a book, whether it's a fictional book or a factual book. We don't have time to learn about the context, the audience, the history, the culture of the author or the book that the person wrote. And a lot of times we don't really need it. What we do is we read it from our own perspective. Perhaps your parents told you to, before you talk to somebody, to walk a mile in their shoes. That really means that in order to really understand somebody, you have to be able to see the world from their perspective. When it comes to reading and interpreting texts, we all have this lens of ours that comes from our own experiences. The history that we've learned, the cultures that we've been associated, most likely dominated by the culture in which you live, in which you grew up in, or in which you grew up. So that would be like the default lens, and a lot of times we don't realize that we're reading something through a lens. We just think that we are interpreting it the way it ought to be interpreted. But depending on the text that you're reading, interpreting, a lens that you use will be more and more important. For instance, a lot of times when we're reading the Bible, it might be recommended to you that you apply textual context. So sometimes you'll see somebody, like in the back of the football stadium holding up the sign that says John 3:16. So you could go to that verse, John 3:16, and read it, but what you've done is you've just read that one verse. So a textual context would be to read the passage in which the verse lies. So you might read all of John chapter 3, or you might read all of John in order to understand more what that verse means. Definitely there are verses that you can take out of context. That's where that phrase comes from, out of context. You take it out of the context that it was in, whether it's a textual context or some other context, and make a verse, a passage, mean something which it wasn't intended to mean. Let's see what else we have here. So here are some important. So we talked about textual context. Another type of context which can be important is rhetorical context. That is understanding the rhetoric, the rhetorical tools and devices that were employed by the author, and especially when a book like the Bible is translated from an original language to another language like English, it loses all of the rhetorical context. For instance, a lot of the Old Testament stories are written in a chimeric Hebrew poetic form, poetic device. And there's, you can't expect the interpreters are just trying to read the text and figure out what these Hebrew words mean in English. You can't really expect them to try to also include the poetic devices that were used. So that can be important. Specifically, this Pharisaical lens is for interpreting the Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament. And what's, I think, most important is to consider the cultural and historical contexts. So the cultural context is reading a passage with knowledge and consideration for the culture of the author and the audience. And this is especially necessary when reading text that is written by or for a culture which is different than yours. Historical context is awareness of the people who created the sources, their living conditions, the scene, the setting at the time. Was there a war going on, for instance, or was there a famine? It may include political beliefs or ideologies that were present at the time, but that's the historical context. And again, this is especially important if the author and audience was written in the distant past. That means that the history is very different from the history that you live in. So if you think about that from in terms of the Gospels, the culture and history, the cultural and historical context of the Gospels is very, very important, because they were written 2,000 years ago, and they were written with an audience written by and for an audience of Jewish people for the most part in the Gospels. And so it becomes very important to know the Jewish culture of the first century Jews and the historical context, what was going on in terms of the history of the Jews of the first century. Especially when it comes to the Jewish culture, which was defined and created by God in the Old Testament by the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant itself defined a way to live, and that way to live was like 180 degrees different from all of the other cultures. It was said that you could see a Jewish person from a mile away and know that is a Jewish person coming towards you. And they couldn't even, for instance, spend time or be under the roof of or eat with Gentiles, people who didn't have this culture. They couldn't even associate with them because of the rules, the laws of that culture. So the Jewish culture of all cultures is very, very different from our culture. It's even different from the modern Jewish culture. I can't say that I'm an expert in the modern Jewish culture, but things in the Jewish culture has definitely evolved, especially since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. But then, of course, from all of the other history that's occurred from 70 AD till now. So you have to take all this into account. And you kind of have to, if you're thinking about this now, if you're thinking contextually as I'm talking, you might think to yourself, man, I've just been picking up the Bible and reading it. how did I ever expect to interpret it correctly? And that's correct. That's a right way to think. Most people don't have the time to understand the culture and the history, and it was 2,000 years ago. So it's difficult to even find texts that are outside of the Bible to learn that from. So, what do we do instead? Well, we read it from our modern perspective. And that can be fine in terms of extracting information from the Bible. Things like the characters, their interactions, the stories, the flood, Genesis, Abraham, Jesus. If you think about it from like a children's ministry perspective, what do we teach children when they come to a children's ministry class in church? Well, you teach them the characters and the stories of the Bible. And so that's good. It's good to have that information, that background. But what about when it comes to applying the Bible to your own life, to all of the important decisions that you make? What you're doing is you're using the Bible itself as a lens for your own life. So that's very important to do that. And so most of the time we get our lens or our interpretation for books like the Gospels from church, the church that we go to. So did those people, not necessarily the preachers, but they're usually some teachers or people who have put together and assembled the doctrine for various churches over history, do we know that they took the time to understand the culture and the history of first century Jews and applied it properly when interpreting the Gospels and other parts of the Bible? Well, you don't really know. You put a lot of trust in those people. But probably one way to know if you have a good lens, a good interpretation of the text, is what I refer to as dark corners. Dark corners are parts of the passage where you really have no idea what it's talking about. It doesn't mean what it says it means. For instance, if Jesus says you need to gouge out your eyes and cut off your right hand, well, there's not a lot of people with their right eye and their right hand cut off. So, it must mean something else. I don't really know exactly what it means, but I'll just kind of pass over it and go to the next verse, and hopefully the next verse isn't something weird. I'm not saying that's a bad method. That's what most people do. Sometimes they might hear in church what a pastor or a teacher thinks about a particular passage, like the one we're talking about. They might say, well, Jesus was employing hyperbole here to show how important it was, to not look lustfully on women in this particular case. But is that true? Is that really what Jesus was doing? Well, you're putting a lot of trust in the teacher and the preacher and the doctrine of the church that you go to. And so what I want to do in this series is put together some information that I have extracted over the last 10 years, really, about first century Jewish culture. A lot of it comes from a person by the name of Aaron Budgen. He's a friend of mine. He has his own web page, Living God Ministries. You're certainly welcome to go look at his website and his teachings. And he has a lot of what's called the radio archive, so they're all listed there. And try to extract from all of this information what the Jewish culture was like. He himself was studying to be a Jewish rabbi, so he wasn't just a Jewish person, but he was also studying to be a teacher of Judaism in Jerusalem, and so he was confronted with a lot of this thinking, at least from a modern perspective, but also from a historical perspective. So what the idea is to take all of that information and try to package it nicely into a lens that you can use then to interpret the Bible, at least from that perspective. And it does still take a lot of trust in me or this person, Aaron Budgeon. But you can also go to these different texts, and that's what I want to talk about now, is how and where do you learn about first century Judaism? That's 2,000 years ago. And of course, you can read about it in the Bible, but the Bible, especially the Gospels we're talking about here, that's what we're trying to interpret. So it's a very circular thing to say that we're going to get the culture and history in order to interpret the text that we're currently reading. I'm not saying it can't be done. You can definitely, read the Gospels. You'll know, immediately there are these people called the Pharisees. They seem to be very important. You can see that there's the Romans. They're in charge. You see Pontius Pilate. So you can see all these different things. But how are you going to learn, or read between the lines? Well, there are some ways to do that. Now, if you're reading a normal book, you want to know a lot about the author and his audience, but first you want to learn about the author. So the author of the Bible, the author is God. And in the Gospels, it's Jesus. There's a lot of text, and the interactions are all surrounding this character named Jesus, who is God, incarnate. That's what Christians believe. He's God living amongst his people for a short time of 33 years. And really, we only get to know about the last three and a half years of when he started his ministry. So how do you learn about Jesus other than reading about Jesus? You might have heard the phrase, the cliche, what would Jesus do? It's a frequently used mantra of Christians, and it is a good question to pose to yourself when you're deciding something. But does anyone really know what Jesus would do in your circumstance? You might say something like, well, I know he would act in a loving way. Well, now you've just transferred your decision to now writing on what does it mean for Jesus to act in a loving way. It's still very vague. It's still unknown. For instance, if you can try to go back in time before you ever read the Bible, before you ever read the Gospels, and pretend like you're reading, or try to remember when you were reading the Gospels for the first time, could you ever predict what Jesus was going to do next? I mean, the answer is no. I mean, even if you think the answer is yes, the answer is no. You couldn't predict it. I mean, it's one of Jesus' defining characteristics, is his unpredictability, because he is God on earth. And so how, does God think? Well, good luck if you know that. Then you don't need to, you can turn this channel off and you should make your own channel. So it's very difficult to say that you know the culture. And what other book are you going to go to learn about God? You could think about other religious texts, but we know that they talk about other gods, or God in a different light or something. So where are you going to? What are you going to do to get the cultural context and history? Well, the next best thing to do is to look at the audience. Who was Jesus talking to? How did they think? How can you walk a mile in their shoes? So how do you find out about the history and culture of the first century Jews? Well, first of all, there's the Old Testament. So a lot of people have read parts of the Old Testament. Some people have read the whole Old Testament. A lot of people know, all the stories of the Old Testament. But a lot of people also think it's very dry, and some of it can be very dry, very difficult to go through. It's a good, it's 2/3 of the Bible, so it's bigger than the New Testament, and there's a lot there. Nevertheless, it is a good idea to know a lot about the Old Testament in order to know what the Jews are like. If you think about our own history, and up until like the end of the 1800s, when there are my dogs again. We're live. When the Industrial Revolution started, that is really when things like went into high gear. I mean, things are totally different now than they were even just a few years ago. Before that, things changed more slowly, but nevertheless, they still changed. There's a big difference between the people of the 1800s and the people of the medieval times, or in the people of the 4th century, when Rome ended. But it was still changing more slowly. So you have the Old Testament, but the other thing to keep track of is there's this 400-year gap between Malachi and when the Gospels start. But like I'm saying, that things didn't change as rapidly as they do now, and so you can go with the assumption that their culture didn't change much in that period and be correct. So you can also look at the history of the nations around the Jews. So in the Gospels, it was the Romans. Now there are many Roman historians who talked about the Romans themselves, how they, for instance, went into what's now England, and how the Gauls attacked them from the north, and how the nation itself expanded out from Rome. But in terms of the Bible, we really just have one historian whose work still survives. So that's 2,000 years ago. That's a long time for a text to remain. His name was Tacitus, and basically what we can say is he mentioned Jesus. So it's not a lot to go on. But so that we're not going to get much out of Roman history, with the 400-year period between the Old Testament and New Testament. You can learn about the Greek history. It certainly doesn't hurt to know about Roman history. You can certainly learn about that. It's not going to help you much, though, when it comes to interpreting Jesus. So there's another set of books called the Apocrypha. Those are what's called outside of the biblical canon. So the canon of the Bible are the accepted books of the Bible. There's 66 in the, I don't know what you'd call it, the current Christian canon. But, if you look at the Catholic Bible or the Eastern Orthodox Bible, there's several other books that are in there. And a lot of those are what... I guess you'd call them evangelicals. I'm not sure what to use. Denominations, churches that are outside of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Those apocryphal books, even if you don't consider them as canon, meaning that they're the words of God through a prophet, they're still an excellent source of historical and cultural information. Particularly, there's 3 books called... from the Maccabees, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees, and they talk about the Maccabean revolt or wars, which happened from 167 to 160 BC. They revolted against the Seleucid Empire, which was one of the 4 offshoots of the Hellenistic Grecian Empire of Alexander the Great. So when Alexander the Great died, he was very young. I can't remember the age. You'll have to check it up, but it's like 30 or something. His empire was immediately divided into 4 sections, his 4 generals. One of them was called the Seleucid Empire, and that's the one where Israel ended up lying. And these Maccabean Wars were the Jews revolting against the Seleucid Empire, and they miraculously won. It really was quite a thing. Some people will talk about how the Seleucids were weakened because they were fighting several wars, which is true. Nevertheless, this ragtag fugitive fleet of Jewish people led by the Maccabees miraculously 1 and start at what is called the Hasmonean dynasty. And that existed from 167, basically the beginning of the wars, to 37 BC. And part of that time, they were, so from 167 to 160 BC was the main wars, but there were still wars and conflicts with other Jewish sects, as well as the Seleucids didn't quite give up. But from 104 BC to 63 BC, they had independence, true independence in the Hasmonean dynasty. And 63 BC is when the Romans invaded. So that's all information that you can get from reading these apocryphal books, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees. Very interesting. I recommend that you do it. So there's another historian who's a Roman Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus. Josephus, you may have heard of Josephus. He wrote several books that are compiled into another book called the Antiquities of the Jews. And he was a military leader, historian. He was considered a traitor by the Jews because during the Jewish uprising, he went over to the other side, the Romans, and the Jews didn't appreciate that. And so they don't like his history, of course. But as Christians, we can read it. And he lived from 37 AD to 100 AD. And he gives accounts of people like Pontius Pilate, King Herod, John the Baptist, the Pharisees. There's a lot of information in there about the Pharisees. Some people think that Josephus may have been a Pharisee. He probably wasn't, but he certainly knew a lot about the Pharisees. But he also talked about the Sadducees and the Essenes. That's lived out in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. He talks about James, the brother of Jesus, and how he was killed or martyred. And he may have mentioned Jesus. Here's kind of one of the problems with Josephus, is that the reason why we have his works all the way till now is because the church preserved them. So really the Catholic Church preserved all of his history, but they very likely modified them as well to give like an extra biblical or outside of the Bible credence to Christianity. I have a note in the description to an essay that was written about this. So, it does mention Jesus. It actually says he was the Messiah, but, it wasn't him who wrote that. It was added later on. Nevertheless, it doesn't throw all of his history, all of his writings, all of the information in his books into question. So there's another book called the Mishnah, which means to study repeatedly. And that's the consolidated oral traditions done by a guy named Judah the Prince in 200 AD. It's the writings of many, many Jewish rabbis, all the way from 500 BC to 200 AD. It's difficult to know, the times that those rabbis lived, but most of them likely lived after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. But they still contain very important information about the Pharisees and Jewish thought. And they were initially oral traditions, and then they were written down in 200 AD. So these oral traditions are referred to in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, in Matthew 15:2 and in Mark 7:5. Jesus asks, or actually the Pharisees ask, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? So the tradition of the elders were the sayings and thoughts of all these rabbis, and then they were compiled into the Mishnah. So that's a very important text to read. So there's another one called the Midrash, which means to interpret. So these are all historical Jewish books. The Midrash is an expansive Jewish biblical exegesis written by rabbis. It's not canonical, but it is mentioned in the Old Testament twice, in 2 Chronicles 13:22 and chapter 24, verse 27. Not that the whole Midrash existed at that point, but certain parts of it did. And it was really just these rabbis, Jewish teachers, who would kind of expand on biblical texts. And there's another book called the Talmud, which means the teachings. And that is comprised of the Mishnah, which we already talked about, and also something called the Gemara. And the Gemara means finished. So what it really is the Mishnah with embedded text in the various sayings of the rabbis, or at the end of the sayings of the rabbis. Gemara means finished. So basically, it was the final say of the Jews. And again, just like the Mishnah, it's an important text to understanding the Pharisaical teachings. So that brings us to the Pharisaical lens, and this is what we're going to talk about in the next 6 or 7 weeks. This will probably end up being an 8-part series, and we're going to go through each one of these arrows here and talk about how they influenced the Gospels. How do they influence how we interpret the Gospels? Each one of these is very important, and they're all part of what I call the Pharisaical lens. And so, hopefully, you will find this interesting and also that interesting the next few weeks. I think it will really help you understand and interpret the Bible, understand some of these dark corners that you might have. And I'll also do that as well as kind of apply the lens as we go to certain passages in the Bible and show how it helps interpret them, helps people understand some of these things. So thanks a lot for joining me today, and have a great day. I'm actually out of town next Sunday, so I'm not going to have a lesson next Sunday. So the next one will be the following Sunday at 5 o'clock p.m. Thanks.